August 1938. Kharkov Locomotive Factory, Ukraine. Designer Mikhail Koshkin stood before Stalin's Armor Commission with a proposal they called cowardice dressed as mathematics. Soviet doctrine demanded thick vertical armor. Heavier meant stronger. Koshkin's team proposed something different: sloped plates that used geometry instead of weight to stop shells. Senior officers dismissed it as a retreat from real engineering. In Stalin's Russia, unconventional ideas could get you executed. But Koshkin ran the numbers. A 45mm plate angled at 60 degrees offered the same protection as 90mm of vertical armor. Half the weight, double the protection. The math didn't lie. March 1940. Against direct orders, Koshkin drove two T-34 prototypes 2,000 kilometers through frozen Russian winter to prove his design could survive combat conditions. The journey gave him pneumonia that would kill him 6 months later. But the tanks rolled into Moscow's Kremlin grounds still running. June 1941. German panzer crews learned a new sound, the crack of their shells striking steel, followed by the sickening whine of a ricochet into dirt. Their guns couldn't penetrate the T-34's sloped front armor. German field reports called it invulnerable and demanded immediate countermeasures. By 1945, Soviet factories had built over 84,000 tons 34 seconds, more than all German tanks combined. Every modern battle tank today uses sloped armor. How did one engineer's illegal geometry become the reason a generation of panzer crews learned to fear angled steel? Before we dive in, hit subscribe for more stories where the history books buried the details that changed everything. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. August 1938. The design bureau at Kharkov Locomotive Factory in Ukraine hummed with the industrial tension of a nation preparing for war. Mikhail Koshkin, a four-year-old engineer with 15 years of Stalin-era factory work behind him, stood over drafting tables covered in technical drawings that would either save his career or end his life. The Red Army had issued a demand that left no room for failure: design a new medium tank to replace the aging BT-7 cavalry tank, fast, reliable, and capable of surviving the modern battlefield. The Soviet Union needed thousands of them, and they needed them before Germany came knocking. Koshkin's team had been working for months on what they called the A-32, a medium tank built around a radical principle that made senior military engineers shake their heads in disgust. Instead of mounting thick vertical armor plates like every other tank in the Soviet arsenal, Koshkin proposed sloping the armor at sharp angles. The mathematics were elegant and undeniable. A 45mm plate angled at 60 degrees from vertical offered the same effective thickness against incoming fire as a 90mm vertical plate, half the weight, double the protection. The shells would strike the angled surface and glance away, deflecting rather than penetrating. It was geometry, not metallurgy, trigonometry, not tonnage. But in the halls of Soviet military doctrine, elegance meant nothing without ideology. Tank design in 1938 followed a simple philosophy inherited from the trenches of the First World War. More armor meant more protection, and anything less was a compromise born of weakness. Senior officers called Koshkin's sloped armor a retreat from real engineering, a trick to avoid building proper defenses. One commission member reportedly told him it was cowardice dressed as mathematics. The accusation carried weight far beyond professional criticism. In Stalin's Soviet Union, where the Great Purge had recently devoured thousands of engineers, scientists, and military officers on charges of sabotage and treason, unconventional thinking could be fatal. Koshkin's own colleagues warned him quietly. This was not the time to be different. But Koshkin had come too far to retreat into orthodoxy. Born in 1898 to a peasant family, he had worked his way from a confectionery factory apprentice to a trained engineer through night schools and relentless self-education. He survived the Civil War. He survived the famines, He survived the purges by keeping his head down and his work flawless. Now, at 44, with the Reich rearming and the world tipping toward war, he believed the math more than he feared the consequences. He ran the calculations again and again, checking variables, testing assumptions, conferring with his deputies in whispered conversations that never made it into official reports. The numbers held. A shell striking sloped armor at an oblique angle had to travel through more steel before reaching the interior. The effective thickness increased with the angle. It was physics, immutable and provable. March 1939. The A-32 prototype rolled onto the firing range at Kubinka Proving Grounds outside Moscow, a sprawling complex where Soviet tanks were tested to destruction. Koshkin and his team watched as Red Army artillery crews prepared to fire contemporary anti-tank rounds at the vehicle's sloped hull. The tests were clinical and brutal. Shells slammed into the armor at combat ranges, each impact documented by engineers with stopwatches and measuring tape. The results defied the predictions of every senior officer who had called the design weak. The sloped plates deflected round after round. Shells that would have punched through vertical armor of the same thickness struck the A-32's angled plates and ricocheted away, leaving gouges but no penetrations. The math had become steel, and the steel had held. But survival on the test range was only half the battle. The A-32's armor was impressive, but its weight was modest compared to competing designs. Critics argued it was under-armored, that real combat would expose its vulnerabilities. Koshkin proposed a compromise that revealed his true confidence in the geometry: thicken the armor to 45 millimeters. The weight would increase, but the slope design would still make it more resilient than heavier tanks with vertical plates. And unlike those heavier tanks, the A-32 retained the mobility and speed of the lighter cavalry tanks it was meant to replace. During trials, it matched the performance of the A-20, a lighter competing design, proving that protection and speed were not mutually exclusive when geometry did the work of mass. Stalin's Armor Commission reviewed the data through the spring of 1939. The reports were clinical but undeniable. The up-armored version of the A-32, now designated the T-34, offered unprecedented protection without sacrificing mobility. In December 1939, the Commission issued its approval for production. Orders went out to Kharkov, Stalingrad, and Leningrad. Begin tooling for mass production. 600 T-34 tanks were authorized for delivery in 1940. Koshkin had won, but the victory felt hollow and incomplete. Approval on paper meant little in a bureaucracy where projects could be canceled with a signature, where engineers disappeared into the gulag on whispered accusations, where survival meant proving your worth again and again. The T-34 existed as blueprints and prototypes, but skepticism remained thick among senior officers who still believed real armor meant vertical armor. Koshkin knew that paper victories evaporated in the face of political wins. To save his design from the scrapyard, to prove the T-34 was not a gamble but a certainty, he would need to demonstrate something no Soviet tank had ever done before. He would need to prove it could survive the one test that destroyed machines and men with equal indifference: a Russian winter at combat speed, over open roads, with no backup and no second chances. And he would need to do it without permission, because permission would never come. March 5, 1940. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Kharkov tractor factory, where two T-34 prototypes sat in the assembly yard, their engines silent, their sloped hulls coated in morning frost. Mikhail Koshkin stood beside the lead tank, a leather jacket pulled tight against the wind, studying a map that showed the route to Moscow. 2,000 kilometers of frozen roads, mud-choked villages, and wilderness stretches where a breakdown would mean abandonment. The factory had completed its trials. The tanks had passed every test the engineers could devise. Now the Red Army High Command wanted a final demonstration in Moscow, a formal presentation before Stalin's top military advisors. Standard procedure required the tanks to travel by rail, secured on flat cars to prevent mechanical damage during transport. Koshkin had spent the previous night writing orders that violated that procedure completely. At 52 years old, feeling the persistent chill of winter deep in his bones, Koshkin made a decision that could end his career or his life. He would drive both T-34 seconds the entire distance to Moscow, proving their durability under the worst conditions the Soviet Union could offer. If the tanks could survive a Russian winter at combat speed, they could survive anything the Wehrmacht would throw at them. If they broke down, if they failed, if they proved fragile or unreliable, then his design deserved to die on those frozen roads rather than in a factory debate. But he would know. The Red Army would know. And the math would be proven or disproven in steel and diesel fuel. His deputies gathered in the factory office that morning and begged him to reconsider. The NKVD was watching. Unauthorized use of military equipment constituted sabotage under Soviet law, a charge that carried a firing squad as its only sentence. The tanks were state property, designated for rail transport under explicit orders. Driving them cross-country without permission was not a bold demonstration, it was a crime. But Koshkin had survived Stalin's Russia by understanding when rules mattered and when survival mattered more. The T-34 would live or die based on performance, not politics. He assembled a skeleton crew, drivers, a mechanic, a physician named Dr. Barakin, who warned him that the cold could be fatal for a man his age, and a photographer to document every kilometer. No backup vehicles, no supply convoy, no safety net. The tanks rolled out of Kharkov on March 5th, their V2 diesel engines growling in the frigid air, exhaust vapor trailing behind them like smoke signals announcing an act of defiance. The first day covered 180 kilometers, the tanks maintaining an average speed of 42 kilometers per hour on open roads, faster than the BT-7 cavalry tanks they were designed to replace. Koshkin rode in the lead tank, feeling every jolt, every shift in the transmission, every strain in the suspension as the vehicle chewed through frozen dirt roads and patches of spring mud that grabbed at the tracks like quicksand. The cold seeped through the steel hull. The crew rotated positions every hour to avoid frostbite. At night, they slept in villages where peasants stared at the strange tanks with sloped armor, whispering questions the crew could not answer. By the third day, the temperature dropped to 15 degrees below 0 Celsius. Ice formed on the vision ports. The roads turned treacherous, alternating between frozen ruts and stretches of mud deep enough to swallow a truck. The tanks pressed on. Koshkin monitored every mechanical sound, every hesitation in the engine, every vibration that might signal a coming failure. On the fifth day, one of the tanks threw a track on a particularly rough stretch of road outside Orel. The crew dismounted in the freezing wind, working with numb fingers and pry bars to refit the track onto the drive sprocket. 90 minutes later, the tank was mobile again. No catastrophic failure. No show-stopping breakdown. Just field-repairable damage that any crew could fix with basic tools. The journey stretched across 12 days and 13 nights. The tanks crossed rivers on ice that groaned under their weight. They climbed hills where the engines screamed and the tracks dug trenches in frozen earth. They passed military convoys whose drivers stared in disbelief at the two experimental tanks driving through conditions that would have immobilized half the vehicles in the Red Army. Koshkin developed a cough on the 6th day. By the 9th day, it had deepened into something wet and rattling. Dr. Barakin urged him to stop, to seek medical attention, to abandon this illegal demonstration before it killed him. Koshkin refused. The tanks were still running. The test was not complete. March 17th, 1940. The two T-34 prototypes rolled through the gates of the Kremlin grounds in Moscow, their hulls covered in ice and mud, their tracks caked with frozen earth from a dozen provinces, their engines still running with the steady diesel rhythm that had carried them 2,000 kilometers without a critical failure. Koshkin climbed down from the lead tank, his face pale, his breathing labored, his body racked with fever. Stalin's engineers swarmed the vehicles immediately, measuring track wear, inspecting the suspension, checking the transmission for damage. The tanks had averaged 42 kilometers per hour over the entire journey. 0 critical breakdowns. 1 thrown track, repaired by the crew in an hour and a half. The sloped armor showed scrapes and dents from debris, but no structural damage. The demonstration was undeniable. Koshkin stood in the cold March air, watching the engineers take their measurements, knowing he had bought his design a future. In June, the Red Army placed its first major production order. 600 tons, 3-4 tanks, with more to follow. The factories at Kharkov, Stalingrad, and Leningrad received authorization to begin mass production. The gamble had worked. The illegal journey had become proof, but the cost had been extracted in full. Koshkin's pneumonia worsened through the spring. He refused extensive hospitalization, insisting on overseeing the production setup, correcting technical issues, ensuring the tanks rolling off the line matched his specifications. By September, the infection had spread to both lungs. On September 26, 1940, Mikhail Koshkin died in a Moscow hospital, 6 months after proving his tank could survive anything. He never saw a T-34 fire a shot in anger. He never saw one face a German panzer. But he died knowing the math had held, the geometry had worked, and his tanks would roll into a war he would not live to see. The production lines were running. The Reich was less than 9 months away. September 26, 1940. The day Mikhail Koshkin died in a Moscow hospital, the production lines at Kharkov tractor factory were already running. His successor, Alexander Morozov, a 5-year-old engineer who had worked alongside Koshkin since the earliest T-34 designs, inherited both the blueprint and the burden. The Red Army's order was clear and unforgiving. Deliver 600 tons 3-4 tanks before the end of 1941. No extensions, no excuses. Soviet intelligence reported that Germany was massing forces along the border, that war was coming, that every month of delay would be paid for in blood. Morozov understood what Koshkin had known from the beginning. The math was perfect. The geometry was proven. Now they had to build it faster than any nation had ever built tanks before. 3 factories received the technical drawings and production quotas in the fall of 1940. Kharkov Tractor Factory, where Koshkin had designed the original prototype. Stalingrad Tractor Factory, a sprawling industrial complex on the Volga. And factory number 183 inches Nizhny Tagil, deep in the Ural Mountains, far from any border. Each factory faced the same impossible challenge: transform a hand-built prototype into a mass-produced weapon using workers who had never seen sloped armor, supply chains that had never sourced these specific components, and production schedules that assumed perfection. The reality was chaos measured in steel and sweat. The workers who built the first production T-34 seconds were not the skilled machinists of peacetime industry. They were teenagers pulled from collective farms, widows of the purges trying to survive on factory wages, exiled engineers whose technical crimes had been pardoned in exchange for industrial labor. Many had never worked a lathe. Some had never seen a tank. But they knew Koshkin's story, whispered across the factory floors during shift changes. The engineer who died proving his design could fight. The man who drove 2,000 kilometers through winter to save his math. They built as if his ghost was watching, as if every weld and rivet was a debt owed to a dead man's certainty. The production process revealed problems Koshkin had never encountered in the prototype phase. The sloped armor plates required precise angles to maintain their deflection geometry. A plate welded at 58 degrees instead of 60 degrees would compromise the effective thickness. Workers hand-fitted each plate using protractors and chalk lines, tearing out shoddy welds and redoing them on their own time. The V2 diesel engine, a 12-cylinder marvel that Koshkin had adapted from aircraft designs, required machining tolerances tighter than most factory equipment could achieve. Early engines leaked oil, misfired, or seized after a few hours of operation. Mechanics stripped them down and rebuilt them, learning through failure what the technical manuals could not teach. By December 1940, Kharkov had delivered its first production T-34. The tank rolled off the line with a transmission that ground gears, optics so poor the driver could barely see through the vision port, and a finish so rough it looked like it had been assembled in a barn. But the sloped armor was perfect. The angles held. The plates were welded to tolerances tighter than factory specifications required. The geometry worked exactly as Koshkin had calculated. Morozov ordered the tank stripped and rebuilt, documenting every flaw, every shortcut, every compromise that would kill a crew in combat. The lessons went into revised production manuals that were distributed to Stalingrad and Nizhny Tagil. Through the winter and spring of 1941, the production numbers climbed. January delivered 115 tons 34 seconds. February delivered 147. March delivered 177. The factories operated on 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week, with workers sleeping in factory dormits between shifts. The cost per tank stabilized at 270,000 rubles, half the price of the KV-1 heavy tank and a fraction of what Western nations were paying for comparable armor. The Soviet system, for all its cruelty and inefficiency, had discovered that mass production could overcome individual quality when the design was sound. A T-34 with a rough transmission was still better than no T-34 at all. But quantity meant nothing without doctrine, and doctrine was where the Red Army failed catastrophically. The T-34 seconds rolling off the production lines in early 1941 were dispersed across dozens of tank brigades and mechanized corps, scattered from the Baltic to the Black Sea in small packets of 5 or 10 vehicles. Most crews received less than a week of training. Radio equipment was scarce. Only platoon commanders had radios, and many of those were unreliable or incompatible with infantry frequencies. The tanks were designed to fight in coordinated groups with infantry support, using their mobility and armor in combined arms operations. Instead, they were treated like mobile pillboxes, dug into static defensive positions or sent forward in unsupported charges that tactical doctrine from 1918 would have recognized. By June 22, 1941, Soviet factories had delivered 1,225 tons 3-4 tanks. Approximately 967 were operational, scattered across the western military districts in ones and twos, undertrained crews, without spare parts, without fuel reserves, without the tactical framework that would allow them to fight as Koshkin had intended. German intelligence had noted the new Soviet tank in reports, but dismissed it as another crude attempt at armored warfare, clumsy and poorly deployed. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 5 weeks and France in 6. Soviet armor would be no different. June 22, 1941, 3, 15 inches the morning. Operation Barbarossa began with 3 million German soldiers crossing the Soviet border on a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Luftwaffe destroyed 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the ground in the first day. Panzer divisions raced through gaps in Soviet defenses, encircling entire armies before they could mobilize. The Red Army's forward positions collapsed in hours. Tank brigades were overrun before their crews could start their engines. T-34 seconds were abandoned for lack of fuel, destroyed by airstrikes while sitting in depots, or captured intact when their crews fled. In the first 3 weeks of Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht destroyed over 20,000 Soviet tanks, a loss rate so catastrophic it would have ended any other nation's ability to fight. German officers filed after-action reports describing the T-34 as clumsy, poorly crewed, and tactically irrelevant. The sloped armor was noted as an interesting design feature, nothing more. Panzer crews celebrated their kill counts, painting rings on their gun barrels for every Soviet tank destroyed. Berlin issued victory communiques predicting the fall of Moscow by September. The math that Koshkin died proving seemed irrelevant in the face of German operational superiority, better training, better coordination, and a doctrine refined through 2 years of conquests. The T-34 was failing not because the geometry was wrong, but because geometry alone could not win a war. Then, in a forest near a Lithuanian village called Rasinii, something changed. A single Soviet heavy tank using the same sloped armor principles as the T-34 blocked a German supply route and refused to die. June 23, 1941. A single KV-1 heavy tank sat across a narrow road near Rasinii, Lithuania, blocking the main supply route for the German 6th Panzer Division. The crew had been cut off from their unit during the retreat, surrounded, with no orders and no way to withdraw. They made a decision that morning that would enter German military legend. They would hold the crossroads until they ran out of ammunition or the tank was destroyed. The KV-1 used the same sloped armor principles that Mikhail Koshkin had pioneered on the T-34, its plates angled to deflect rather than absorb incoming fire. For the next 48 hours, that geometry would rewrite German assumptions about Soviet engineering. The first German unit to encounter the KV-1 was a motorized infantry column carrying supplies forward to the advancing panzer spearheads. The tank opened fire at 800 meters, its 76mm gun tearing through trucks and half-tracks with methodical precision. The Germans called forward their standard anti-tank support, 37mm POC, 36 guns, the same weapons that had destroyed Polish and French armor with ease. The crews set up at 400 meters and opened fire. The shells struck the KV-1's sloped hull and bounced away, leaving bright scars on the armor but no penetrations. The tank rotated its turret and destroyed both guns with 2 shots. German commanders radioed for heavier weapons. A battery of 50mm PaK-38 anti-tank guns, the most modern equipment in the Wehrmacht's arsenal, was brought forward under cover of darkness. At dawn on June 24th, the guns opened fire from multiple angles, hitting the KV-1 with over a dozen direct hits. The armor held. Shells ricocheted into the dirt and trees. The tank's crew, low on ammunition but still mobile, continued to fire at any vehicle that approached the crossroads. German engineers attempted to approach under covering fire and plant explosive charges on the hull. The tank's machine guns cut them down. For 2 days, the KV-1 sat at that crossroads, absorbing punishment that would have gutted any panzer in the Wehrmacht's inventory. The 6th Panzer Division's war diary recorded the incident with language that bordered on disbelief. Officers described the Soviet tank as nearly invulnerable, its armor impervious to standard anti-tank weapons. On the morning of June 25th, the Germans brought forward an 88mm anti-aircraft gun, the same weapon used to destroy fortified positions and heavy bombers. The crew set up at 700 meters, outside the effective range of the KV-1's gun, and began firing high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. The first shots missed. The second and third struck the tank's turret and hull, finally punching through the sloped armor after more than 70 hits from various weapons over 48 hours. German infantry moved in with satchel charges and finished the job. When they opened the tank, they found the crew dead at their posts, the interior scorched and torn, but the basic structure of the vehicle still intact. The report from Rasinii reached Berlin within days, but it was dismissed as an anomaly, the product of a single lucky crew and isolated circumstances. Then similar reports began flooding in from across the entire front. Near Brody and Dubno in western Ukraine, German panzer divisions advancing through the frontier zones encountered T-34 seconds in battalion strength for the first time. The battles were chaotic, disorganized, often one-sided in Germany's favor due to superior tactics and coordination. But panzer crews learned a sound that would haunt them for the rest of the war. The sharp crack of their gun firing, followed by the metallic ping of a shell striking sloped armor, followed by the sickening whine of a ricochet spinning away into the dirt. The German 11th Panzer Division filed a report on June 26 that used language no Wehrmacht armor unit had employed since the invasion of Poland. The T-34's frontal armor was described as immune to the 50mm Quak 38 gun at all combat ranges. Crews reported firing 6, 8, 10 shots at a single T-34 and watching every round deflect or ricochet. The mathematics that Mikhail Koshkin had calculated in 1938 were now being proven in the forests of Ukraine. A 50mm German armor-piercing round could penetrate 55 to 60 millimeters of vertical armor at 500 meters. But the T-34's sloped 45mm plates, angled at 60 degrees from vertical, offered an effective thickness of 75 to 90 millimeters. The shell had to travel through more steel, at an angle that encouraged deflection rather than penetration. The geometry didn't care about doctrine or ideology. It simply worked. Panzer crews developed new tactics out of desperation. They began targeting the T-34's tracks and suspension, trying to immobilize the tanks rather than destroy them. They called for air support, using Stuka dive bombers to attack from above where the armor was thinner. They set ambushes at close range, hoping to hit the turret ring or rear hull where the armor was weaker. But in direct frontal combat at standard engagement ranges, the T-34 held an advantage that no amount of training or experience could overcome. German tankers who had spent 2 years as the hunters of Europe suddenly found themselves as prey. The reports reached Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist, commander of the 1st Panzer Army, in early July. His assessment was clinical and devastating. He called the T-34 the finest tank in the world, superior in armor, armament, and mobility to anything Germany fielded. He demanded immediate countermeasures: longer guns, better ammunition, new tank designs. German military intelligence began emergency assessments of the T-34's specifications, trying to understand how Soviet engineers had achieved such a dramatic advantage. The answer, when they found it, was elegant and infuriating. Sloped armor, geometry over mass, mathematics over metallurgy. The same principles German engineers had dismissed as insufficient were now standard on a tank they could not reliably kill. But Soviet losses remained catastrophic through the summer of 1941. In the first month of Barbarossa, approximately 200 tons 34 seconds were destroyed, not from armor failure but from everything surrounding armor. Crews with less than a week of training made fatal tactical errors. Mechanical breakdowns stranded tanks in the field where they were captured or destroyed by German infantry. Fuel shortages left entire brigades immobile. The lack of radios meant T-34 seconds fought as individuals rather than coordinated units, allowing German panzers to isolate and flank them. The math had worked, but math alone could not compensate for the collapse of Soviet command and control. By September 1941, German panzer crews had learned to respect the T-34 even as they continued to destroy them in lopsided engagements. Captured examples were shipped back to Germany for analysis. Engineers at Daimler-Benz and MAN began designing new tanks that would incorporate sloped armor as a fundamental principle. The Panther tank, which would enter service in 1943, would copy the T-34's frontal armor angle almost exactly. The Tiger, already in development, received modifications to increase its armor slope. Every new German tank design from 1942 forward would reflect the lesson Mikhail Koshkin had proven and paid for with his life. Sloped armor was no longer a trick or a compromise. It was the future of armored warfare, and the Germans were 2 years behind. The T-34 had stopped believing it could die. Now German engineers had to build something that could kill it. November 1942, Stalingrad. The city had become a graveyard measured in city blocks and frozen corpses, where Soviet and German forces fought room to room through the skeletal remains of factories and apartment buildings. Outside the city, in the windswept steppe where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Celsius, T-34 tanks formed the armored backbone of Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive designed to encircle the German Sixth Army. The tanks that rolled into position that winter were not the scattered, poorly coordinated machines of 1941. They were products of an industrial transformation that had remade the Soviet Union into the largest tank producer on Earth, churning out T-34 seconds faster than Germany could count them, let alone destroy them. By late 1942, Soviet factories were producing 1,300 tons 34 seconds every month. The assembly lines ran continuously, fed by workers who had evacuated from the Western factories as the Germans advanced. When Kharkov fell in October 1941, Factory number 183 had been dismantled, loaded onto trains, and relocated 1,500 kilometers east to Nizhny Tagil in the Ural Mountains. The workers reassembled the production lines in unheated warehouses while winter set in, working in temperatures cold enough to freeze lubricants and crack steel. Within 3 months, the factory was producing tanks again. By mid-1942, it was outproducing every German tank plant combined. The T-34 that emerged from these wartime factories was simpler and cruder than Koshkin's original vision. Non-essential components were eliminated. The transmission remained unreliable, but crews learned to nurse it through battles. The optics were poor, but tank commanders fought with their heads out of the hatch, using binoculars instead of periscopes. The interior was cramped, uncomfortable, and deafeningly loud, but the sloped armor remained precise, the angles maintained to the geometry Koshkin had calculated because that geometry was what kept crews alive. Production costs dropped to an average of 193,000 rubles per tank by 1943, cheaper than a truckload of ammunition expendable in the mathematics of industrial warfare. The crews who climbed into those tanks were no longer the undertrained conscripts of 1941. Soviet tactical doctrine had evolved through catastrophic failure into something brutally effective. Tank brigades received standardized training that emphasized coordination with infantry and artillery. Radio equipment became standard issue, allowing platoons and companies to fight as unified formations rather than individual vehicles. Crews learned to use the T-34's mobility as a weapon, flanking German positions, exploiting breakthroughs, withdrawing before superior firepower could concentrate on them. The tank that had been wasted in static defense in 1941 was now being used as Koshkin had intended, fast, maneuverable, and protected by geometry rather than mass. At Stalingrad, the T-34 proved its value in conditions that destroyed German armor. The Wehrmacht's Panzer III and IV tanks used gasoline engines that froze solid in the Russian winter, requiring crews to light fires beneath the engine compartments just to start them. The T-34's V2 diesel engine, designed by Koshkin's team for reliability in extreme cold, started in temperatures that would immobilize the German fleet. While panzer crews huddled around fires and waited for their engines to thaw, T-34 seconds rolled into attack positions before dawn, striking German supply lines and artillery positions in temperatures that turned metal brittle and flesh numb. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 became the proving ground for everything Soviet industry and doctrine had learned. Germany launched Operation Citadel with over 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including the new Panther and Tiger heavy tanks designed specifically to counter the T-34's armor advantage. The Panthers mounted long 75mm guns that could penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at 1,000 meters. The Tigers carried 88mm guns that could kill T-34 seconds from ranges where Soviet tankers couldn't even see the target. On paper, the Germans fielded superior technology, better trained crews, and a concentration of armored force unmatched since 1941. The Soviets met them with 5,128 tanks, over half of them T-34 seconds, deployed in massive defensive belts backed by anti-tank guns, minefields, and infantry with artillery support. The battle became an attrition nightmare where numbers and industrial capacity mattered more than individual tank quality. For every Panther that destroyed 3 T-34 seconds, Soviet factories built 4 more T-34 seconds to replace them. For every Tiger that dominated a section of battlefield, 10 T-34 seconds flanked around it, targeting the weaker side and rear armor. German crews discovered that sloped armor worked both ways. Their new Panthers, designed with frontal armor angled to match the T-34's geometry, were just as vulnerable to flank attacks as Soviet tanks. Kursk lasted 2 weeks and ended with German offensive power broken permanently. The Wehrmacht lost over 760 tanks and assault guns, losses they could not replace. Soviet losses exceeded 1,600 tanks, but by August the factories had already made up the difference. The mathematics of industrial warfare had proven decisive. Germany could build a better tank, but the Soviet Union could build 10 adequate tanks in the same time, and 10 adequate tanks with trained crews and proper support would win against 2 superior tanks every time. By 1944, the T-34 had evolved into the T-34-85, mounting a larger 85mm gun in a 3-man turret that finally matched the firepower of German medium tanks. The sloped armor remained unchanged, still using Koshkin's original geometry, because the geometry still worked. The improved model entered production without disrupting the assembly lines, a seamless upgrade that maintained output while improving combat effectiveness. Soviet factories produced over 22,000 tons 3-4-85 seconds in 1944 alone, more than the total production of all German tank models combined. The drive to Berlin in 1945 was spearheaded by massed formations of T-34 seconds, rolling through Poland and into Germany itself with the momentum of an industrial avalanche. German defenders fielded whatever armor remained. The last Panthers, the surviving Tigers, improvised assault guns built from obsolete chassis. None of it mattered. The T-34 seconds came in numbers that defied tactical response, supported by artillery, infantry, and air power in combined arms operations that the Red Army had learned through 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. When Soviet tanks reached Berlin in April 1945, the sloped hulls that had once seemed like a mathematical trick were now the symbol of Germany's defeat. Mikhail Koshkin never saw a T-34 fire a shot in anger. He died believing his design might be shelved, forgotten, rendered obsolete by politics or wartime expedients. Instead, his geometry became the most produced tank design in history. Between 1,940 and 1,945, Soviet factories built 84,070 tons 34 seconds and T-34 85 seconds, more than all German tank production combined, more than American Sherman production in the same period. The workers who built them, the crews who drove them, and the engineers who refined them carried Koshkin's logic into every battle, every production run, every technical improvement. He gave them proof that geometry could stop shells. They gave him a legacy written in the mathematics of victory. His name appears on no monuments in Red Square, but every modern main battle tank uses sloped armor. His trick became orthodoxy, his defiance became doctrine, and his math became the reason a generation of German tankers learned to fear the glint of angled steel.